We live in a world our ancestors would barely recognize. Around the globe, the impact of human ingenuity is now everywhere. We've pushed back the limits of our planet at speeds, depths, and heights that would have left our forebears breathless. Driving all these achievements is humankind's extraordinary gift for invention. Through genius and inspiration, we've created exceptional solutions to complex problems. From the everyday to the spectacular, some good and some not so good. This series celebrates the million ways our great inventions have transformed our world.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Our oceans, rivers, lakes, and seas can be challenging. To cross them, we throw ourselves at the mercy of the elements.
I think there is a kind of romance about setting off over the horizon.
We carved out simple floating vessels and harnessed the power of the winds and currents, often in the face of great danger.
Those early sea journeys were horrific. The number of ships that were lost was extraordinary.
What changed to make onboard conditions not just desirable, but the reason for travel? What feats of engineering had to be overcome?
You have to worry about the equilibrium of this thing. What happens if you tilt it a little bit? Is that stable, or is it going to topple over?
This is the story behind some of the biggest ships on our seas and oceans today, capable of taking us to the most remote destinations on our planet. The cruise ship, a great invention, spawned by our love of travel by sea. Human beings are hardwired to be curious and to explore. We can jump in a plane or a fast car and go wherever we like quickly. Or we can also choose to travel by sea at a more sedate pace on a cruise ship.
Cruise ships are such a great invention because they enable a pretty energy-efficient way to take thousands of people around beautiful places that they would otherwise never get to go to.
According to industry research, 30 million tourists globally were predicted to cruise in 2019. And the annual number is expected to keep on rising. Today, cruises visit 2,000 ports of call around the world, assuaging our appetite for the new and the different. We also like to relax and indulge ourselves, enjoy comfort, and feel spoiled.
On a cruise, there is a lot of entertainment provided for the guests, usually great food as well, and they get to meet other guests too. So overall, the experience is fantastic for them.
Cruise ships are a multi-billion-dollar industry providing significant employment. Marine engineers are constantly innovating the ships, and designers develop increasingly sophisticated attractions to entice people on board. Yet fundamentally, a cruise ship is a large floating box with an engine and lots of small boxes on top, and it carries passengers from one destination to another. Since cruise ships began, each floating assembly of boxes is like a treasure trove of treats. In a highly competitive market, with every new ship's design, operators strive to stand out to win our business. At the root of this great invention was our desire to travel across water as fast as the winds could carry us. and more comfortably than basically sitting on floorboards. But how did we do it? For thousands of years, water transportation was simple. We had no roads to help us move around on land, so traveling across any terrain could be slow and inhospitable.
The reality is that for most of human history, seas and rivers aren't barriers. They're actually the most effective way of traveling long distances.
We can trace boat building back to the Neolithic Stone Age. This rock art in Norway is as much as 6,000 years old. Archaeologists have found dugouts dating back 8,000 years. This one in the Maritime Museum in Oslo is a mere 2,200 years old, a simple, hollowed-out tree trunk. Early seafarers were hungry for adventure as well as for food.
We always think the grass is greener. We must explore. It's part of our nature. If you stop human beings exploring, you stop them being human beings.
Communities around the world developed their own wooden vessels, all powered by the winds and sometimes oars. Many still used today in modern incarnations. Early versions of this sampan in China navigated up and down the Yangtze River, for example. Dhows, similar to this one, sailed the rivers and waterways of the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. The feluccas that these are derived from were working on the River Nile for thousands of years BCE. By 1500 BCE, the Polynesians had developed relatively advanced technology, strapping together two canoes, which gave their vessels greater stability. This 1949 footage shows replicas of vessels that carried Polynesians to colonize the islands of Hawaii in 500 CE. So early pioneering seafarers had figured out the rudiments of how things float. But we needed to understand this better if we were to develop our capacity to carry more things and more people across water. The theory wasn't properly understood until a certain ancient Greek was enjoying a private moment. It was to prove to be one of the biggest moments in time and in the history of the cruise ship. Remember who shouted Eureka, but why?
You may have heard that famous story of Archimedes getting in the bath and then literally shouting Eureka. This moment of realization that his body displaces the same amount of water as its own volume. And this led to Archimedes' principle, which is what accounts for the buoyancy of boats.
The ancient Greek word eureka means "I found it." Archimedes turned it into an expression that's now understood the world over. He had discovered the law of buoyancy.
Something will float on water if the downwards force of gravity is less than the upwards force created by the buoyancy of the water. So in other words, a boat will float if it weighs less than the amount of water that it displaces.
But how can an enormous cruise ship made of heavy component parts of iron and steel with thousands of people on board possibly float?
Over time, as boats have gotten bigger and more impressive, they're still ultimately following that first basic principle of physics, of water displacement creating buoyancy. And so these big ships aren't really doing anything that more special than a little canoe.
Archimedes' Eureka moment was a game changer. We were beginning to understand the science of building larger, more complex craft to travel on water. These would be able to carry more people in one go. Crossing the Atlantic became one of the most important routes in international travel. For instance, We know the Vikings sailed west between the 8th and 11th centuries CE. They traveled from various parts of Scandinavia to North America, leaving lasting evidence of a settlement in Newfoundland.
For most of human history, you travel because you have to. You travel because you're part of an invading army, or you travel because you're escaping something at home, or you travel because you hope to make money.
Empire building was a major incentive. A cluster of famous Atlantic crossings were made by Italian explorers led by Christopher Columbus in 1492. Columbus, who was sponsored by Spain, paved the way for future European travelers migrating to the New World. These voyages continued until the next transatlantic milestone, which saw the Pilgrim Fathers flee England to build a settlement on the east coast of North America. The Mayflower set sail in 1620 from England, bound for the New World, depicted in this romanticized film made in the 1950s. It was to be the most grueling of journeys, miserable and overcrowded.
Those early sea journeys were horrific. The number of ships that were lost was extraordinary. Conditions on board were terrible. We didn't have refrigeration, for instance, so the food was shocking. You would really have to want to form a new world to get on that boat. I think the only thing that would sustain you would be the promise of something much, much better at the other end, because that kind of travel was probably hell on earth.
The 102 passengers were puritanical Protestants, desperate to escape their ungodly homeland. They wanted to establish a farming community in Virginia where they would build their own church. They set off relying solely on the power of wind, with an estimated 37 crew and the captain on board.
The sanitation on the boat probably would have been pretty poor, so they would have experienced dysentery, tummy upsets as a result of that. There may not have been fresh water on the boat, or indeed fresh fruit and vegetables, so the likely consequence of that could have been dehydration, perhaps even poor nutritional intake, and it could lead to conditions such as scurvy, for example.
The crossing was to last 66 days, a voyage into the unknown.
For most of the passengers, it means a knowledge that you're not ever going to see your home again. But for those who will see the promised land, that's exactly what they expect to find. They are leaving behind the corruptions of Europe, they're leaving behind the intolerance of England, and they're going to build a city on the hill, the New Jerusalem. And so that has to be worth it. It's a journey of faith.
Faith also that the winds would carry them, however long it took, and however grim the journey. Today's cruise ships are a service industry with passengers' comfort paramount. They're a masterclass in precision planning in every area.
We are a floating hotel, so we have to be so self-sufficient. And in terms of planning, organization, we need to ensure we have everything we need from the safety perspective, from food supplies, water supplies.
In this classless cruising world, all passengers can expect a degree of luxury. For decades, that has meant a private self-contained cabin with its own bathroom and other conveniences.
In a day like today, we turn around 1,300 cabins. We have in average 2,600 guests embarking today.
Everything in the housekeeping department is on a massive scale to service all these rooms and more from eye-wateringly large stocks.
We have like 30,000 pillowcases, just for an example. In terms of towels, we have more than 50,000 towels of different sizes and purpose on board the ship.
When the ship is ready to depart on its next cruise, all 19 decks will be ship-shape, and thousands of excited passengers will be hotly anticipating their new adventure. Back in the early 18th century, enabling passenger ships to travel further and faster was the next challenge. Under sail, the journey from Europe across the Atlantic could take at least 6 weeks or more. We had to invent a way to stop us relying on winds and currents, which are so unpredictable and uncontrollable. When the Industrial Revolution came along, there had to be a new mechanical solution for ships. Inventive minds turned to a technology which had been around for nearly 2,000 years that had never been usefully exploited. A mathematician and engineer called Heron of Alexandria had worked with a simple combination of water and fire to create steam. His Ilopile, or wind ball, was the first steam-powered engine. Heron's design has a sealed cauldron of water placed over a fire. Fixed to the cauldron are 2 hollow tubes suspending a hollow sphere with 2 outlet tubes. The steam from the cauldron rises through the tubes into the sphere and out of the outlet tubes. This causes the sphere to rotate. At the time, it was simply an amusing toy with no practical applications. And its potential for marine technology lay dormant for centuries. Hungry for progress and efficiency in the 18th century, engineers started playing around with steam power. The turning point came in 1769 when Scotsman James Watt patented his improved steam engine. And the Industrial Revolution got going in earnest. American engineer Robert Fulton is credited with inventing the first viable steamboat, which was trialed on the Hudson River in 1807. The steam engine drove 2 side paddle wheels which propelled the ship forward, although the ship was also fitted with sails. The Clermont became the world's first steamboat in public service, putting Fulton into the record books. Paddle steamers have continued to operate until the present day on many of the rivers of North America, including the Mississippi. In fact, cruising has proved to be an incredibly successful invention on the world's waterways, from the Danube to the Nile. Crossings between Europe and North America were to become considerably shorter thanks to steam. The first steam-powered ocean-going ship to make this journey was the SS Savannah in 1819. Like the Clermont, she was a hybrid of sail and steam, her steam funnel just visible through the sails. This was truly the start of a new era. We would never have to rely on wind power again. We had the passenger capacity, but decent accommodation for all was woefully inadequate. We had the technology, but it needed improvement for long-distance voyages. Perhaps the ancient Greeks would have the answer once again. Archimedes had invented a screw, like this modern copy in the Netherlands, which can remove water from the bottom of a ship. By turning the inclined screw, water at the bottom is forced up and out at the top. Its potential for propulsion inspired a Czech called Joseph Ressel, whose invention, patented in 1827, is still in use today. Ressel's idea took up much less space in the ship than paddle wheels and was more efficient. It was called a screw propeller. The SS Archimedes, named in honor of the genius ancient Greek, was the first steamship to be fitted with Ressel's screw propeller.
These ships have a propeller on the underside, and what they're doing, by spinning this propeller, it creates a column of water that you're forcing out the back of the ship. Just by Newton's third law, if you're pushing on the water, that means the water's pushing on you. So if you're shoving a column of water going out the back, then actually the water is pushing back, and that's what's giving you thrust. It's what's propelling you forwards.
Steamship design evolved quickly from here. By 1843, British engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel launched the SS Great Britain, now carefully restored to its former glory. Brunel appeared to be breaking all marine engineering records and rules. With the capacity to carry 252 passengers and 130 crew, she was bigger than any previous ship. She was made of heavy wrought iron, and her steam engine was the biggest and most powerful yet, and drove one of Joseph Russell's new screw propellers.
So the bigger the ship, the more powerful the propulsion needs to be. You need really, really big propellers to provide enough force to move all that water out of the way.
But the motivation to build the SS Great Britain was still not about the journey itself. She was not a cruise ship. After her Atlantic crossings, she went on to carry thousands of immigrants from Europe to Australia. It is said that 500,000 people now living in Australia can count their ancestors among those who traveled on the SS Great Britain. All contemporary cruise ships are driven by propellers. They don't have to move fast, but it's important that a voyage isn't bumpy, so they have more than one.
We have two propellers, so two propulsion motors, which drive the propeller shaft, which is then attached to the propeller. We are outward hand, which basically means one goes clockwise, one goes anti-clockwise. So our propeller's like that, to minimize vibration.
When any ship prepares to embark on a new cruise, like this one in the 1970s, the crew want to be sure their guests will enjoy a smooth voyage.
Stand by below. Stand by below high.
Turning today's even larger ships in the relative confines of a harbor is a great skill, all masterminded from here, the bridge, where the captain and his team direct the voyage.
When we are doing maneuvering of the ship, it's captain or myself. The instruments that we are using is all this top-notch equipment that we're having on board. Radar with the electronic chart. We have also all controls and all the indicators with the vessel movement. The most important factors during the maneuver that we're watching is the wind, the current. We have two propellers, one on each side, and then we have two rudders as well, one directly behind each of the propellers. The thrusters are the small propellers that are pushing water from one side to the other of the ship, and those are making the ship turn. Of course, then we can turn the ship 360 degrees in one spot.
It's testament to incredible modern engineering that a cruise ship can turn in a confined space using a combination of mechanics and the forces of nature, winds, currents, and water, which is so much harder to move in than air.
The water's incredibly dense and it's viscous, so you actually need a lot more force and torque to be able to get that thrust, but you'll get more from it just because it's more dense. So actually, those propellers on cruise ships, they don't appear to go round very fast, but you're getting, a lot of propulsion out just because it's water and not air.
Such a massive vessel takes a long time to stop in water. You can't put the brakes on and stop a ship like you can a car. When the captain of this ship, the Costa Concordia, changed course in Italian waters, she ran aground on a rocky outcrop. Most passengers escaped in lifeboats, but 32 were killed, and the captain was jailed for manslaughter. Fortunately, accidents like this are extremely rare, but it demonstrates the risks and navigational skills required to maneuver a cruise ship. From the mid-19th century, steamships carrying passengers were operating all over the world, but they were still not called cruise ships, and they were expensive. It wasn't until a German shipping magnate, Albert Ballin, spotted an opportunity that the cruise line business was born. In 1891, Bellin's masterstroke was to organize the first ever Mediterranean cruise on board the Augusta Victoria, hosted by Bellin himself with his wife. The cruise lasted 57 days with 241 passengers on board. The ship sailed from Southampton down through the Strait of Gibraltar and round the Mediterranean, stopping at more than a dozen ports along the way.
It's one of the great developments of the modern age that people begin to travel just for the sake of traveling. It's the product of rich people who want to see the world. It's the invention of the tourist, if you like.
Bellin's big idea was that the journey should be a pleasure, not a pain. Fastest didn't necessarily mean best. He wanted to provide unrivaled luxury for first-class passengers to enjoy the ride, with larger cabins, the finest decor, and food that matched the smartest hotels in the world. Next came Bellin's greatest triumph, the design and launch of the world's first cruise ship, built specifically for ocean cruising, the Prinzessin Victoria Louise. A model of the ship sits in the International Maritime Museum in Hamburg, Germany, home city of the original ship. Designed as a pleasure yacht offering unrivaled luxury, her maiden voyage in 1901 took passengers from Hamburg to New York. The Prinzessin Victoria Louise carried first-class passengers exclusively in 120 spacious en-suite cabins. No lower classes were catered for, unlike the majority of other transatlantic services at the time, where the cheap ticket holders had nothing to look forward to except the destination. Traveling in third class, as these 1930s passengers had to, often meant sleeping in bunks close to the engine room, where stoking the fire with coal to create steam made it noisy, hot, and dirty. The engine room on a contemporary cruise ship is still noisy, but not nearly as grimy as those early steamboats. And these days, passengers aren't allowed anywhere near. The engine takes up the entire first and second decks, with weight distributed in a relatively spacious area to aid buoyancy. The ship is a floating diesel-electric powerhouse, requiring constant monitoring and maintenance. Power generated from its 6 diesel engines is enough to run, for example, 130,000 homes in a northern European climate for an hour.
We are asynchronous, which basically means once we are generating and moving, we generate the power that we need. So, for example, if we require a full-speed run, we would put all 6 engines on. If we are on a slow-speed run, we can achieve that on tube. The temptation would normally be to take your foot off the accelerator, but partial loading on big engines like this, they don't like it. They like to be at the top, screaming and really thumping it out.
So, to achieve a moderate speed, it's more efficient to run 2 engines at full power than 4 engines at half power. It's a turnaround day, and the tanker is arriving to replenish stocks in the ship's 20 fuel tanks. Coal is long gone, replaced by more efficient and powerful oil.
This will be giving us our fuel stem for today, for next cruise, 12 days. And today we are going to be lifting 1.1 million litres of fuel in 2 different grades.
The ship runs on a combination of marine fuel oil and marine gas oil. At capacity, she can cruise for 8,000 kilometers without refueling.
It's an ongoing obsession with marine engineers to design ships that travel further with less fuel. It's all about efficiency, because you might change the angle of the bow, for example, and that could make a massive difference to the amount of fuel you use. Or you could change the shape of a propeller blade. Just these small changes make a huge difference. I think that's what excites engineers.
Since the first cruise ships, the other major fuel on board has been the stuff that keeps the thousands of passengers and crew going, as seen in this 1960s promotional film.
Eating is one of the real joys of shipboard life, where even the healthiest appetites meet their match. Even breakfast can give you the choice of dozens of items.
The catering department must ensure that there are enough provisions ordered to suit the tastes and appetites of every guest for the duration of the next cruise. So how do you feed over 4,000 passengers and crew? Answer: the work never stops.
Why we need the 24-hour bakery on board is because throughout the night we need to prepare all the bread for the breakfast. In addition to that, the room service is 24 hours, and our international cafe, they have breads, croissants and pastries, Danish pastries, etc.
Meanwhile, upstairs, passengers can enjoy a slower pace of life, if they so wish.
Some people view water as very calming, very hypnotic. They enjoy that process, they enjoy the slowness of it. And I think it's good for your mental well-being to travel to other places where you're stepping outside of your comfort zone. You're learning about other cultures, other countries, other foods, and all this is good for the brain.
There have been periods when cruise ships have offered rest and relaxation doing a very different role. In times of war, they rescue and provide medical treatment as hospital and transport ships to serving soldiers. This one was requisitioned as a Red Cross hospital ship in World War II. Here bringing wounded soldiers home from service in Africa.
With the Red Cross at her masthead, a former luxury liner enters a British port. She is now the hospital ship Atlantic.
The fact that these cruise ships are used in war is a brilliant illustration of what they actually are, which is just a very large vessel capable of taking huge numbers of people from one place to another, that these are actually just a means of transport. In peace, they're decorated, they're filled with entertainment, and their reality is hidden. And in war, that becomes apparent.
But marketing makes sure that people know that every new cruise ship or liner is so much more than just a very large vessel. The hype around Titanic's launch was immense. She was hailed as the world's largest liner, her design and spec outstanding. She had cost $7.5 million to build, roughly $170 million in today's money.
For some people, the Titanic's just another ship. It's just the thing that's going to take them at speed from the UK to America.
However, she wasn't just another ship, but for all the wrong reasons. Safety measures had been cut, with not nearly enough lifeboats for the number of passengers and crew on board. When Titanic famously hit an iceberg, most of those on board didn't stand a chance.
It is advertised as the latest and the most impressive and the safest and the fastest and the most technologically advanced ship that's ever been built. And that's why the catastrophe is so shocking, because this is about the capacity to produce something utterly, utterly wonderful, and that being destroyed by a combination of human error and the natural world. And that's why it's such a terrible, terrible shock.
Titanic had been marketed as unsinkable, and yet the unthinkable happened, with over 1,500 lives lost. Experts now reckon Titanic sank because of a fatal combination of reasons. The captain didn't take iceberg warnings seriously. The crew didn't have binoculars to spot how close the icebergs were, and the ship was traveling too fast in those icy conditions.
One of the issues was that they just weren't able to turn quick enough, so they hit the iceberg, right? But the other thing was that they had this system in place to enable this sort of scraps, but they just pushed it too far. They were sort of like air tanks. You know, a certain number could allow water in should a collision occur, and it still would be fine. That's why they called it unsinkable, because they thought, oh, this is foolproof. But it turned out that if you did too many, then it's past the point that it's stable anymore.
Tragedy provided big lessons. Cruise ships and ocean liners today are built to much higher standards of engineering and quality of materials. Advanced technology ensures that accurate and reliable hazard warnings are given much sooner. Crew training is more rigorous with vastly improved communication systems. Everybody on board can feel their ship is virtually unsinkable.
I think they combine a feeling of total safety and security with a sense of adventure.
The measures in place are so strictly observed, cruising these days is one of the safest possible modes of transport. We're now in a period of growth. 50 new ocean-going cruise ships are expected to be at sea by 2027. Construction of this new cruise ship represents more mind-boggling statistics. She is taking 3 years to build, from cutting the first piece of steel to launch, and she will be 6 meters longer than the height of the Eiffel Tower when she's finished.
Any form of travel always involves me thinking about how it's functioning and how it's been built and constructed. And cruise ships are really fascinating because they are made of such heavy materials. The material that a cruise ship is made out of, if you had a solid block of that metal, it would sink, for sure. But the way it's designed to incorporate air and space and surface area means that it floats.
After the prefabricated hull has been put into position in the construction shed, she is built up from that level, mostly resembling building blocks that slot together. Every detail has been planned while mindful of the bigger picture.
You have to worry about the equilibrium of this thing. What happens if you tilt it a little bit? Is that stable or is it going to topple over? So you have to think about the stability, and that essentially is what determines the shape of the underside of a ship. You know, how can we make it so that it's stable, that if any small displacement that may come from currents in the water or things like that, that will right it back up so it's not going to just fall over.
Altogether, she requires 3 million man-hours to construct, and she will have cost around $760 million from start to finish. A century ago, shipyards looked very different, with so many more jobs done by skilled workers. However, working conditions were dirty and dangerous. Building cruise ships was ultimately about creating an irresistible destination where dreams would come true. In the 1930s, cruising was still a pursuit exclusively for the rich, and that would become unsustainable. The cruise ship industry was heading for a crisis. People's attitudes and personal circumstances began to change as the world recovered from another painful war. By then, many workers had begun to have paid holidays and more disposable income. The cruise ship industry was in danger of being out of touch. However, in 1952, the SS United States was launched, the most modern ocean liner yet. Apart from offering speed and comfort, like so many liners before her, she appealed to those with a taste for luxury. But all this was not enough to stop the turning tide. A new era of international holiday travel was dawning with the jet age. Package holidays were the new way to go and appeal to the masses.
The real advent of package tours, of mass foreign travel for ordinary people in England and Europe is the post-war period. It's the 1950s and 1960s. in which the arrival of cheaper air travel means that ordinary people can go to the places that were not allowed before.
The modern holiday industry was born. Cruise ships couldn't compete with air travel on speed. What they could offer was an alternative journey with accommodation in a luxury hotel. But now it must be for everyone, one-class cruising.
We see the democratization of all this. Not completely, but it means that the cruise brings to a much broader range of people that experience which had been pioneered in the 19th century.
The key was for cruise ships to carry more people on each journey and give them what they wanted, luxury, at an affordable price.
In the 60s, they first became quite popular because they were rebranded as, fun ships. So here is an opportunity to spend time traveling to other parts of the world on water.
By economies of scale and much larger ships, they could bring the per capita cost down, which would draw in a wider clientele.
They used to be just for the rich. It was confined to those who could afford it. And I think as time's gone on, they've become cheaper and more accessible.
There are two big drivers in the cruise ship world today. One is size. The other is ever more ambitious amenities, both onboard experiences and destinations.
Within the cruise industry, there's a belief that bigger is better. The companies between them are always vying for guests. How can we attract guests to come to our product?
Arguably, some places can only be visited by sea, like the Galapagos area, with its incredible wildlife to be seen nowhere else on the planet. Arctic and Antarctic cruises take people up close to more awe-inspiring wildlife with the kind of access that just isn't possible any other way, opening our eyes to extraordinary parts of the planet that remind us of our fragility.
I think going to the Arctic would be interesting for two reasons. First, I think it's a huge reminder of just how important those areas are to the survival of the planet. Two, friends of mine that have been just talk about this extraordinary, humbling beauty. That gives you a real sense of perspective.
We've been fascinated by these frozen worlds since we discovered them, and cruises have been carrying intrepid holidaymakers there since the late 19th century. Polar-class cruise ships present specific challenges to engineers and designers to deal with the cold and ice.
If you're traveling to the Arctic, there are additional considerations like, can the material of the ship withstand, essentially, the impact of icebergs, which, when you're traveling at speed, can be the equivalent of slamming into a mountain face? How do you propel yourself in waters that contain a lot of solids? It's a very different challenge compared to just cruising along an ocean that doesn't contain icebergs.
And when a cruise ship can no longer serve at sea, there is sometimes an afterlife. The SS Rotterdam, for example, is a museum as well as a local hotel in its home city. With sustainability the watchword of our time, cruise ships will need to undergo another revolution in design. In an industry that enjoys scale, should the size of each ship be shrinking? There have been appeals for ships to be more compatible with small historical cities where fragile ecosystems are at risk. The numbers of tourists they disgorge for brief encounters with their target destinations put strains on limited resources and a phenomenon known as over-tourism. Environmental campaigners want greater attention to be paid to cruise ships' carbon footprints and emissions. The industry's use of vast quantities of toxic heavy fuels is having a harmful impact on our oceans, seas, and air quality. The answer could be blowing in the wind.
The big thing that shipping can do is it can more easily be made environmentally sustainable, much more so than air travel, for instance. So that's the really big advantage, that we can shift huge amounts of people and goods around in a more environmentally efficient way.
Engineers and designers are looking at alternative energies, including hybrid electric engines. Tankers are already able to use a kite rig to tow them by harnessing the powerful ocean winds. They can supplement their traditional fossil fuel consumption, cutting costs and emissions using a free resource.
Large tankers have got kites that sort of launch off the front, and they harness the power of the wind, which reduces their emissions. So I can certainly see an ability to harness the wind becoming ever and ever more popular, because actually it's very, very cheap.
It works by catching the wind in the kite, which pulls the rope from the winch. A generator converts the rotatory power from the winch into electricity. Finding a solution like this for cruise ships might be difficult. Perhaps there will be combinations of more planet-friendly fuels and sustainable energies in future.
I don't think in the near future you're going to see shipping powered purely by wind and solar, because the amount of stuff you have to shift requires fuels with very high, what they call energy density, like a lot of oomph. What you might see is alternative fuels, biofuels or fuels made from carbon taken from the atmosphere. Liquid methane is another good fuel that we can now use.
The economies that the engine designers are now doing for burning of fossil fuels is awesome. They are always developing, always changing, making it more economical. Economical, apart from the financial gains, is also we burn less for the same power, therefore less impact on emissions and or any other producing of sludge from the heavy oil.
While engineers work at new, more planet-friendly technologies, at the other end of the spectrum, onboard entertainment will continue to push the boundaries. This first-ever cruise ship roller coaster, named the Bolt, promises riders they'll travel about 60 kilometers per hour with plenty of twists and turns along the way. For those with less thrilling ambitions for their cruise, there will be other new entertainment.
It's almost like a one-stop shop. You get to see different countries, travel without having to take your suitcase out, go to a different hotel, hire a car, do all of that. It's all in this one space. You can have a social life, you can have an active life, you can just sit on deck and watch the world go by, but you're traveling all the time. So I think these are all the reasons why a lot of people love cruise ships.
We've traveled a long way from the humble canoe. As vessels have grown bigger and more sophisticated, the energy we use has shifted from the natural power of the wind to coal-fired steam to today's diesel engines. Tomorrow? Who knows? Maybe we'll go back to using wind and other sustainable sources of energy. Cruise ships give us an inherently simple way to travel that takes us into a mini world, away from it all, far away from traffic jams and airport queues. The need to explore the world and its oceans and seas from a comfortable base will surely never leave us.
What we have now is a world in which relatively ordinary people get to spend a fortnight at a time living a life that they would never have been able to live in previous centuries. And that surely is a good thing.